2:13 and 11 seconds in the morning. That's the exact moment a 19-year-old gas station clerk named Dalton Reyes stops stacking energy drink cans behind the counter because something on the small monitor above the register catches the corner of his eye. He doesn't turn to look. Not yet. He tells himself it's a moth near the lens or headlights bouncing off the pumps. He's tired. His mother has a hospital appointment in 6 hours, and he picked up this overnight shift so he wouldn't have to ask her for gas money. He goes back to stacking cans. He will not think about that monitor again for 2 days. Then a corporate auditor in another state, someone who has never set foot in this town, flags a 4-second clip buried inside 1,100 hours of footage, and Dalton's ordinary Tuesday night becomes something else entirely. The clip is short. For seconds, a shape crosses the parking lot from left to right, passing directly beneath 2 working security lights. It moves like a person. It has no shadow at all. Not a faint one. Not a partial one. None. The parking lot itself looks almost aggressively ordinary in every other frame of that night's footage. Empty pumps. A slushy machine humming behind glass. A flag on a pole near the road hanging still in 6 miles an hour of wind. The exact reading recorded by a weather station 4 miles away. Nothing about that scene should have produced anything worth a second look. 2 sodium lights hang above that lot, positioned specifically to eliminate blind spots for license plate recognition. Every car, every stray cat, every gust of blown trash that crosses that frame before or after those 4 seconds throws a shadow, sometimes 2. This shape throws nothing. Dalton watches the clip 11 times before he calls anyone. He later tells an officer that on the 12th viewing, his hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady. What was in that parking lot? And why didn't it leave a mark on the light? Those 2 questions are about to pull a state forensic unit, a stolen corporate login, a construction project nobody in town wanted to discuss, and a second identical sighting a mile and a half away into a single case file, one that investigators would eventually stop talking about altogether. The names ahead have been changed, and a few identifying details softened at the request of the people who lived through them. The events, the documents, and the timeline follow the surviving case file as closely as it exists. The gas station sits on the edge of a town of roughly 11,000 people, the kind of place where the biggest local controversy that year had been a disputed zoning permit. Nobody there expected to become the center of anything. Dalton's manager watched the clip once, laughed nervously, and forwarded it to 3 friends. Within 36 hours, it had reached a regional paranormal forum. Within a week, it had crossed 2 million views under a title that used the word demon. Nobody who shared it had spoken to Dalton. Nobody had spoken to police. The story was already spinning ahead of the facts, and that gap between spectacle and evidence is exactly where this case would eventually turn dangerous. Before the clip ever reached a detective's desk, someone at corporate headquarters quietly asked for it to be pulled from the store's shared backup drive, the one synced automatically for insurance purposes. The request cited routine data cleanup. It would have worked if 3 of Dalton's coworkers hadn't already downloaded and shared it the night before. By the time anyone tried to make it disappear, it was already everywhere. Local police assigned the case to a detective named Renata Alvarez, a 14-year veteran with a reputation for closing files quietly and quickly. She has said, since, that this was the only case in her career she never actually closed. Her first instinct was the same one anyone would reach for. Cheap security systems compress footage aggressively, and compression can twist ordinary shapes into something unrecognizable on screen. Malfunction. Nothing more. That instinct lasted 1 day. Alvarez pulled the raw, uncompressed file straight from the store's hard drive instead of trusting the exported clip circulating online. If this was a compression glitch, stripping the compression should have changed what she saw. It didn't. Same shape. Same missing shadow. Same fluid, unbroken motion, frame for frame. Exactly where it had been in the version already tearing through the internet. She sat with that footage alone in her office longer than she's ever admitted to a reporter. She told one colleague, years later, that the stillness of it bothered her more than any violent crime scene she'd worked. Nothing was screaming. Nothing was struggling. It was simply there, and then it wasn't. She checked the lens next, expecting dust, condensation, a smear of pollen catching the light in some deceptive way. The store's maintenance records showed the housing had been cleaned 4 days earlier, and the technician's own paperwork described the equipment as fully functional that afternoon. 2 explanations gone in under a week. Most cases like this die right here, filed away as unexplained but harmless. This one didn't get the chance. Alvarez drove out to the lot herself one night, alone, and stood exactly where the shape had crossed, timing her own steps against the 4 seconds on the recording. She has said the strangest part wasn't standing there. It was how normal it felt, how easy it was to imagine nothing had ever happened in that spot at all. She stayed until almost 3 in the morning that night, watching the 2 sodium lights hum overhead, half expecting, she admitted later, for something to walk past her too. Nothing did. She has never fully explained why she went back a second time, 3 weeks after that. It was the store's register, not the camera, that dragged this case somewhere darker. The point-of-sale system runs on its own separate clock, synced to a different server than the security feed entirely. At 2:13 and 9 seconds, 2 seconds before the shape crosses the lot, that register logs a completed sale. A bag of chips, an energy drink, a real total, rung up under Dalton's login. There is no customer anywhere in the footage. Not before, not during, not after. Alvarez initially chalked it up to clock drift between 2 unrelated systems, an easy 2-second gap most juries would accept without a second thought. Except that register had been serviced and recalibrated only 9 days earlier. A freshly synced clock doesn't lose 2 seconds on its own, not without something outside the system forcing the error. She pulled the transaction record itself, hoping for a card number, a loyalty account, anything that might identify a real customer behind the sale. It had been paid in exact cash, no change given, no receipt printed, a transaction type the store's own system flagged internally as statistically rare for that specific combination of items and total. Exact change, at 2 in the morning, for 2 items nobody remembers selling, printed by a register nobody remembers approaching. Dalton found out about the register discrepancy the same way most of the country did, from a stranger's post online, hours before Alvarez ever called to ask him about it directly. He said later that reading it on his phone in his own bedroom felt like being told a secret about his own life by someone he'd never met. He stopped sleeping well after that. He told a local reporter, carefully and only once, that he kept replaying the shift in his head, hunting for a customer who apparently never existed, and finding nothing every single time. When Alvarez finally sat down with him formally, she asked the same question 3 different ways, hoping something would shake loose. Did you serve anyone right around that time? Did anyone come in you don't remember ringing up? Is there any chance you stepped away from the register for even a few seconds? Each time, Dalton gave her the same answer. No one came in. He never left the counter. He remembers restocking coffee filters, checking his phone once, and looking up at the exact wrong moment to have missed anything. Alvarez wrote in her notes that she believed him completely, and that believing him only made the register entry harder to explain, not easier. She sent the raw footage to a forensic video analyst under contract with the state crime lab, a methodical man who had spent most of his career authenticating dashcam and bodycam footage for criminal trials, the kind of work that rarely made headlines and never involved anything stranger than a blown taillight or a mistimed clock. He would later say this was the first file in 11 years that genuinely unsettled him. His initial report ran 4 pages, dense with technical language about pixel consistency and light refraction, and ended with a single line that Alvarez says she read more times than anything else in the entire case. Under every method available to this analyst, the recorded anomaly is consistent with a physical object present in the frame and inconsistent with any known form of digital or optical artifact. A second analyst, brought in independently by the store's insurance carrier, reviewed the same raw file, and reached an almost identical conclusion, though he phrased his own findings more cautiously, noting only that he could not identify a conventional artifact responsible for the missing shadow, and stopping short of speculating about what that absence actually meant. Two analysts, working for two different clients with two very different incentives, landed in the same uncomfortable place. Neither would call it inexplicable outright. Neither could call it explained either. His mother noticed before he said a word about it. She mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd started leaving the hallway light on overnight again, something he hadn't done since he was small. She sat with him in the hospital waiting room that same week for her own appointment and asked, gently, if he wanted to talk about what was on the news. He said no. She let it go. Some fears, she told him afterward, need to be carried quietly before they can be carried out loud. That's easy to lose in a story built around shadows and stolen logins. Underneath all of it was one exhausted teenager trying to finish a shift and one mother trying to get through a diagnosis, neither of them asking to become the center of anything. Alvarez, meanwhile, went looking for something the cameras and the register couldn't argue with. Physical evidence. Tire impressions in the gravel shoulder beside the lot, photographed and cast in the days following the incident, matched no vehicle registered to the store, its suppliers, or any regular customer on file. She couldn't prove those tracks belonged to that specific night. She couldn't rule it out either. In a file already thin on solid ground, even an uncertain print got measured, photographed from 3 angles, cast in plaster, and kept. She remembers crouching in that gravel at dawn, cold coffee going colder in her free hand, thinking how strange it was that the most concrete piece of evidence in the entire case was a tire tread that might belong to absolutely nobody connected to it at all. The viral spread had, by then, made her job considerably harder. Amateur video analysts online had already declared the case a hoax, a hologram, a government test, sometimes all three within the same comment thread, long before anyone with actual authority had finished a first pass on the evidence. A national outlet ran a segment built almost entirely around slowed-down frames and dramatic music, without once mentioning the register discrepancy that actually made the case worth taking seriously. Alvarez has said watching that broadcast felt like watching her own investigation get replaced by a costume of itself. She fielded calls that week from 3 separate production companies asking for exclusive access to the footage, none of them interested in the register, the right command, or anything that hadn't already gone viral. She declined all 3, a decision she says cost her nothing professionally and bought her, at minimum, a few weeks of quiet to actually work the case. One detail did slip out of that online noise and land, unexpectedly, on Alvarez's desk. A stranger on the same forum that had turned this into a ghost story had cross-referenced a leaked receipt photo against the viral clip's timestamp and posted the register mismatch publicly before Alvarez's own team had confirmed it internally. She has admitted, in a recorded deposition years later, that the leak forced her hand. She moved faster than she wanted to, chasing a public narrative she hadn't chosen and couldn't fully control. What she chased next had nothing to do with ghosts. She requested access logs for the store's remote camera application, the kind that lets a manager check footage from a phone anywhere in the world. What she found didn't fit anyone's ghost story. It fit something far more deliberate. 16 minutes before the anomaly appeared, at 1:57 in the morning, someone remotely logged into that camera system. The credentials belonged to the region's loss prevention manager, a woman named Renee Castillo, who had no obvious reason to be awake, let alone working, at that hour. Castillo told Alvarez, under oath, that she had been asleep at home, 40 minutes away. Her own phone records backed her up completely. The security app hadn't been opened on her device that night. Someone else had her password. That alone might have been an unremarkable story about weak corporate security. Then Alvarez found the second entry in the log, 90 seconds after the login. A write command. Not a view. Not a download. A write. You don't push data onto a live security feed unless you're placing something onto it that wasn't there a moment before. 16 minutes later, a shadowless shape walked across that parking lot. Alvarez never said it outright in her early reports, but it sat in every conversation she had about the timeline afterward. What if nothing actually walked through that lot at all? What if it had been placed there, frame by frame, by someone who understood the system well enough to make an insertion pass as organic? If that's true, the real mystery was never the shape itself. It was the 16 minutes before it appeared, and the question of who needed that particular camera looking somewhere else at that particular hour. Castillo filed her own complaint 5 weeks later, alleging someone had used her identity to access a system she'd had no part in that night. Court records show the matter was settled quietly, funded not by the store's parent company, but by a separate legal entity Alvarez had never encountered before in connection with this case. Castillo signed something. She stopped talking. Alvarez interviewed her twice, once before that settlement and once after, and noted in her own case file that the two conversations felt like they belonged to different people. The first time, Castillo was frightened and open, eager to understand how her own name had ended up in the middle of this. The second time, her answers came in short, careful fragments, and she asked twice whether her attorney needed to be present for questions she'd already answered weeks earlier. Alvarez wrote, in a private note she was careful to frame as impression rather than fact, that she believed Castillo knew more than she was now allowed to say. At one point in that second interview, Castillo reportedly looked directly at Alvarez and said only that some questions weren't hers to answer anymore, then asked if they were finished. Alvarez wrote down the exact phrase because it struck her as an odd thing for someone to say about her own stolen identity. So Alvarez started asking a different question entirely. Not what crossed that parking lot, but why someone would want that specific camera looking away, at that specific hour, on that specific night. The answer had almost nothing to do with the gas station itself. 2.5 miles away sat a construction site most locals barely registered, a plot of land purchased 18 months earlier by a shell company registered out of state. County paperwork described the project only as a logistics and data facility, language vague enough to slide through a sparsely attended zoning meeting without a single follow-up question. Alvarez pulled the amended permit filed 4 months after that initial approval. It quietly added language about temporary overnight storage that hadn't appeared anywhere in the original application. The meeting minutes were at past run barely 2 paragraphs. Every follow-up request she filed after that took longer than the one before it. One county office redirected her to another. That office redirected her to a records custodian who was, according to an automatic reply, unavailable for 6 weeks. By the time anyone answered her directly, the shell company had already reorganized under a different name, and the paper trail she'd been building started thinning out from the middle rather than the edges. The gas station, it turned out, sits directly along the only realistic overnight route between that facility and the regional highway. Traffic camera data from a nearby intersection showed a sudden spike in unmarked commercial vehicle traffic passing through between 1 and 3 in the morning during that exact week. That pattern hadn't existed before construction began. It hasn't repeated since. Something needed to move through that stretch of road undisturbed. And for one narrow hour, on one specific night, the only camera capable of documenting it had something far stranger happening directly in front of it instead. Alvarez parked near that intersection herself on 3 separate nights, unofficially, on her own time, watching for the unmarked trucks the traffic data described. She saw 2 of them on the second night, moving without company markings, without visible plates lit for her dash camera to catch clearly, gone before she could follow without giving herself away. She has said she felt, watching those taillights disappear down the highway, less like a detective closing in on an answer and more like someone who had stumbled onto the edge of something far larger than one gas station's 4 seconds of footage. Sit with that for a second. A viral, shadowless anomaly is exactly the kind of story that spreads instantly, drags thousands of strangers into arguments about shadow physics, and pulls every eye toward 4 seconds of footage instead of toward whatever quietly drove past it. It's an almost elegant kind of misdirection, if that's what it was. Give people a monster to argue about, and nobody thinks to count the trucks. For a while, that felt like the answer. Cynical, but grounded. Corporate secrecy, a stolen password, a manufactured ghost story built to protect a shipment nobody was meant to see. Then, 9 months later, a second camera caught something that broke that explanation apart completely. A paramedic named Mara Whitfield lived 1.5 miles from the gas station, along that same overnight route. She'd installed a doorbell camera after a run of minor package thefts, nothing more dramatic than that. One morning, an automated motion alert sent her a clip she almost deleted without watching. Same shape, same missing shadow, same 4-second duration, only moving in the opposite direction, right to left instead of left to right. Mara had no connection to the gas station and no idea the earlier footage even existed until a neighbor mentioned the resemblance over a fence. She brought her clip to a local news outlet herself, asking for nothing in return, a detail Alvarez later said made her account more credible than most people who come forward in cases like this. Mara's hands shook the first time she showed the clip to a reporter. She said what frightened her most wasn't the shape itself. It was how unhurried it looked, like it had absolutely nowhere it needed to be. She described her own porch to that reporter in detail she didn't need to give. The motion light above her door. The dog 2 houses down that never barks at anything except this. The specific quiet of that street at 2 in the morning, a quiet she said she used to find peaceful before that clip landed in her phone. She told the reporter one more thing, almost too quietly for the recording to pick up clearly. She said that after watching the clip enough times, she started to feel less like she'd caught something on camera and more like something had simply let itself be caught. If the gas station anomaly had been a deliberate insertion built to hide a shipment, this second clip should never have existed. Mara's home network had no connection to that facility. No obvious motive. No corporate stake in anything at all. The same forensic analyst who had reviewed the original footage examined her system directly. No unusual logins. No write commands. Nothing resembling the tampering already confirmed at the gas station. By every technical measure available, Mara's footage looked completely organic. She asked the forensics team a question afterward that nobody had a comfortable answer for. If nothing tampered with her camera, and nothing tampered with the gas station's raw file once you strip away the stolen login and the write command, then what exactly were they saying actually happened in front of both lenses? Nobody on that call answered her directly. Alvarez later admitted the silence lasted almost 10 full seconds before someone changed the subject. Mara says she thinks about that silence more than she thinks about the footage itself. A shape without a shadow is strange. A room full of trained professionals with nothing at all to say is somehow worse. Which leaves 2 explanations sitting in the same file, refusing to cancel each other out. Either 2 unconnected parties produced nearly identical anomalies for entirely different reasons, using entirely different methods, an outcome the analyst privately considered close to impossible. Or something about that stretch of road, at that specific hour, was producing an effect that nobody, corporate or otherwise, actually controlled. If that second possibility is true, the manipulated gas station footage was never the real mystery. It may only have been someone's clumsy attempt to explain or exploit something they didn't fully understand either. That's the point where the people closest to this case started going quiet. The forensic analyst stopped giving interviews around the 8-month mark. His firm released a single line. He was no longer available to comment on matters related to this case. People with nothing to hide rarely need a sentence worded that carefully. Alvarez's department quietly reclassified the file from active to inactive, a bureaucratic move that ends public updates without technically closing anything. She has said, off the record exactly once, that inactive was the department's word for it, not hers. Independent researchers, working entirely on their own time, kept pulling at what remained. One of them eventually mapped the case against similar reports from other states and found something the official file never mentioned. Every documented sighting like this one, across 4 separate cases over roughly 4 years, occurred within a few miles of major shipping corridors, power infrastructure, or data transit hubs, the unglamorous backbone systems that draw almost no public attention precisely because they're built not to. She never published the full study. She said she wasn't ready, and that the pattern didn't unsettle her nearly as much as how quickly certain officials she contacted seemed to already know what she was calling about. She did share a portion of her mapping data privately with Alvarez, who has said it matched almost exactly with her own instinct about the case, an instinct she'd never had the resources or the jurisdiction to test on her own. For counties, for states, and not one shared law enforcement agency between them, all quietly circling variations of the same 4-second event. Then came the detail that turned curiosity into something closer to dread. A footnote, buried inside an unrelated federal filing on critical infrastructure oversight, referenced, in heavily redacted language, an internal review of what it called anomalous data insertion events affecting privately owned surveillance systems near sensitive sites. No agency has confirmed that filing relates to Dalton's gas station, or to Mara's front porch, or to any of it. Every request for clarification has gone unanswered, or redirected, or buried under the familiar language of ongoing review. Alvarez read that filing 3 times the night it was forwarded to her by a contact who asked not to be named in her own notes. She has said it didn't tell her anything she could act on, only that whatever she'd stumbled into was bigger than a single detective in a single county was ever going to be allowed to finish. She stopped requesting updates on the facility's ownership after that, not because she stopped wondering, because every request she filed afterward came back slower, thinner, and eventually, not at all. So where does that leave everyone who lived through it? Dalton eventually left that job. He still keeps his old phone, the one with the original clip still stored on it, in a drawer he rarely opens. He never became a state trooper, the plan he'd had before that Tuesday night. He says he isn't sure he trusts what a camera shows anymore, and some nights, he isn't sure he trusts what he remembers either. He did agree, eventually, to sit for one final recorded conversation about the case, on the condition that it not be released while his mother was still alive to see it. He said he wasn't protecting himself from the questions. He was protecting her from having to answer them for him at the grocery store, the way she sometimes still does. Mara still lives in that house. Her doorbell camera is still running. She checks the footage every morning now, out of habit, and hopes, every single day, that there's nothing on it worth watching. Castillo, in the only written statement she has given since her settlement, said only that she has moved on from that period of her employment. She did not elaborate. She hasn't spoken publicly since. A reporter who tried once more, years later, to reach her for comment received a single line in response, forwarded through an attorney. Some things are better left where they were put. Nobody involved in the case has been able to say for certain whether she meant the settlement, the footage, or something else entirely. Alvarez retired 2 years after the case went inactive. She keeps a printed still frame from the footage in a drawer of her own, for reasons she's never fully explained, even to people who ask directly. She has said only that closing the drawer feels different than closing the case ever did. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, or by now a server, sits a closed-in-name-only case built on 4 seconds of footage that cost one woman her privacy under a sealed agreement, cost one analyst his willingness to speak on the record, and cost a small town its ability to look at its own gas station the same way again. We are left, in the end, without an answer. Only a question that stretches far beyond one parking lot at 2 in the morning. How many of the things we dismiss as glitches, artifacts, or tricks of the eye are actually the visible seams where someone else's carefully built version of reality quietly comes apart, in the 4 seconds when they assumed no one was watching closely enough to notice? Maybe the shape was manufactured, a piece of digital sleight of hand meant to protect a shipment nobody was supposed to ask about. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that has been crossing quiet stretches of road in the dead of night long before anyone pointed a lens at it, and will keep doing so long after this file is forgotten completely. Both explanations should unsettle you, for very different reasons. One means the people meant to protect the truth are willing to fabricate a nightmare to bury it. The other means there are things moving through the edges of our recorded world that no institution, however well-funded, however heavily monitored, actually understands or controls. Neither explanation requires you to believe in anything supernatural. That, in its own way, might be the most unsettling part of all. You don't need ghosts to explain a world where evidence can be manufactured by people with enough access, or where genuine unknowns can slip past every camera we've built to catch them. Both of those worlds already exist, running quietly underneath the one most of us assume we're living in. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with longest. Not the shape, not the shadow it never cast, but the fact that somewhere, right now, another camera is running quietly through another empty parking lot, and no one watching it yet has any idea whether tonight is the night it catches something too.